Today's daf is daf Yud Zayin, and we're up to the second line, El Omer of Yosef, and we're talking about a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. Just one second. Yeah. According to Rabbi Shmuel, the Torah prohibited eating basar taiva, which means you're not allowed to eat meat of Chullin until later on when Klal Yisrael entered into Eretz Yisrael. Then the Torah was matir basar taiva. And Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He holds that basar taiva was always permitted, but not only that, even nechira was permitted during the period of the Midbar. And the Gemara is now interpreting our Mishnah and originally tried to reconcile our Mishnah of Rabbi Shmuel, and now Elam Rav Yosef, Rabbi Akiva, we should understand the Mishnah is reflecting the Shita of Rabbi Akiva, the Sanya, because we learned in the Brayso. So what's Rabbi Akiva's Shita? Ki yirchak mimcha hamokom asher yivchar Hashem elokecha la'asum shmo sham. And we enter now into Eretz Yisrael, and the next pasuk says, "V'zavachta mivkarcha mitzoncha." Now you need shchita. And Rabbi Akiva interprets it, Lo ba'al kosav el lesar bahem basar nechira. So that which was mutter, which means if they pierce the animal through the pipes, the kana and the veshet, that's a replacement for shchita, and that becomes prohibited once they enter into Israel. Shebetchila huta lehem basar nechira, but mishenichnasu la'aretz nesa lehem basar nechira. So now, after presenting this brayso, Rav Yosef adds the following comment. He says, "Achshav shegolu." Once we left Eretz Yisrael, we went into exile. So now maybe we go back to the original status before we entered into Eretz Yisrael when we were in the Midbar. And Yochol, therefore, I might think, Yachzeru le'teira narishon. Now they could eat basar nechira, lekach shoninu, and that's what our mission is coming to teach us. According to Rabbi Akiva, li'olam shochatim, that we require shchita even after we went into Golus. So just make one or two comments here before we go on. So Rabbi Akiva has a very unique shita that there's something that could substitute for shchita, and that was nechira, which was permitted during the time of the Midbar, and they could eat the meat after nechira. They didn't require shchita. Although that was prohibited in Eretz Yisrael, but we might think that after they went into Golus, we go back to the original state. And that's why the Mishnah went out of its way to tell us, Li'olam shochatin, that we require shchita, even after Golus. B'maiko miflagi, Rabbi Akiva savar b'sar taiva lo itzar klal. Rabbi Akiva never accepted the position of Rabbi Shmuel that initially you weren't allowed to eat meat for the sake of the enjoyment of consumption of meat. Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yishmael, from his part, could never accept the possibility that the Torah would permit you to eat meat without shchita by piercing the two simonim. And therefore, in the Midbar period, according to Rabbi Shmuel, it could not be that there was a heter nechira, and that our Mishnah would therefore have to tell us that today in Golus there is no heter nechira, but rather we always required shchita. But during the period of the Midbar, we were not permitted to shecht animals simply for the sake of consumption of meat. Bishleim Rabbi Shmuel, there's another pasuk that says, "V'shachat es ben habakar," and that tells us that while they were in the Midbar, they had to do shchita, which again, according to Rabbi Akiva, doesn't make any sense because Rabbi Akiva holds that during the Midbar period, all they needed was nechira. Ella Rabbi Akiva my shachat. So what does Rabbi Akiva do with this pasuk that refers to the Midbar period and yet it requires shchita? Kodshim shiny. That with regard to kodshim, which during the Midbar period, of course, they would bring karbonos in the Mishkan, they would not be able to bring a carbon unless first they did shchita. But anything that was chulin, according to Rabbi Akiva, You did not require shchita. All you required was nechira. Bishlem Rabbi Shmuel Hainu Dichsiv Hatzon Ubakar Yishachet Lahem. And this is a pasuk in Bamidbar Perkid Aleph. When the Jews came to ask for, they were sick of the man. They came to ask for slav. They wanted to eat meat, and Hashem was angry at them. And He told Moshe Rabbeinu that how many animals, how many tzonu bakar do we have to shecht in order to feed shishim ribui that are asking, demanding for meat? In any event, what's important about this pasuk for our purposes is that it seems that shechita was required. And now we're not talking about kodshim here. We're talking about feeding the people, the masses of people who are demanding meat. So if you hold like Rabbi Shmuel, then everything makes sense, because Rabbi Shmuel holds you must have shechita during the period of the midbar. But the issue was that you weren't allowed to eat basar taiva. Rabbi Kiva, what does the pasuk mean when it says atzonu baki shochet lahem? What kind of shechita? There was no shechita in the midbar. According to Rabbi Akiva, they just simply, knocked off the two simonim with, maybe they took a little bit of something sharp and they pierced through the two simonim. That was enough. It should have said in the pasuk that hatzonu bakar yinocher, because we're talking in the case of the midbar. And the Gemara answers nechira shalahem zui shchitasam. So it doesn't mean that you could just simply, shoot an arrow at the animal and it drops dead and eat the carcass. No, that's not what Rabbi Akiva meant. Rabbi Akiva meant that you didn't need a specific shechita to take the sharpness of a knife and slice the two simonim, but rather nechira was sufficient, in which you did a nechira to the two simonim, and that itself is the shechita to be mat to the basar. Bishlem Rabbi Akiva Hainu Disnan. We understand our Mishnah that on Daf Pei Hey, we didn't get to this Mishnah yet. Hashochet v'nisnavla biyodo v'anocher v'ma'akir potur milechasos. Right, the Torah requires kisui adam in the case of a chaya, if you shecht a chaya. And what happened was, in this case, he didn't do a proper shechita, or he was ma'akir, he ripped out the two simonim without slicing them, or nocher, he pierced through the two simonim with some sharp object, and therefore, since the shechita was not a shechita kshera, therefore poter milchas, meaning kisi adam is only required after the proper shechita. So the shechita itself is machayev the mitzvah of kisi adam, and here that the shechita was improper and invalid, therefore there is no mitzvah of kisi adam. That works out beautifully according to Rabbi Shmuel, because Rabbi Shmuel holds that you require shechita. El Rabbi Akiva, my potem ilchasos, according to Rabbi Akiva, so what if he didn't do shechita, but he did nocher? Nocher is nechira, and according to Rabbi Akiva, nechira is matu the bosa like shechita, and if nechira is like shechita, then it should generate a chiyuv of kisi adam. Why does it say in the Mishnah that you potter from kisi adam? I was a little bit confused about this Gemara, because how can you ask a kasha on Rabbi Akiva from a Mishnah? Rabbi Akiva is a Tana, and he could be cholik on a Mishnah. Anyway, the Gemara answers, Hoil ve'itzar itzar, meaning that this Mishnah is formulating the rule of Kisi Adam with regard to Eretz Yisrael. They already entered into the land of Eretz Yisrael. And now nechira is no longer a matir to substitute for shchita. It requires shchita, and that applies throughout the generations from the time they entered Eretz Yisrael and even after they go into Golus. And therefore, there's no chiyuv of kisi adam if there was nechira, because there was no matir on the basar, and it's only the shchita that's matir the basar that generates a chiyuv of kisi adam. So Gemara says, Bishlem Rabbi Akiva diyomer besar taivalo itzar klal. Hainu dichsiv, ach kasher ye'ochel, es hatzviv es hayal kein tochlenu. So this pasuk seems to assume that you're allowed to eat basar taiva. And the comparison to tzvi and hayal is something that can't be brought on the mizbeach, And therefore, the only reason why you're eating it is because of taiva, because you want to enjoy it. And once they entered into Eretz Yisrael, they're allowed to eat all meat, including deer and hart, which are undomesticated animals that are kosher but can never be brought on the mizbeach. So the pasuk, in referring to the consumption of deer and hart in the wilderness, clearly implies that Jews were permitted to eat non-sacrificial meat at that time, because again, these tzvi vayal could never be brought on the mizbeach. El Rabbi Shmuel is tzvi vayal gufe miavishori. How could the Torah allow you to eat the meat of tzvi vayal, and it's not in the context of kodshim, when according to Rabbi Shmuel, it was an Easter during the period of the Midbar of Basar Taivas. How could they eat the flesh of tzvi vayal? And the Gemara responds, Ki asar achmana behemo dechazio lakrov. Wow, this is a real breakthrough here. It's not that, according to Rabbi Shmuel, straight across the board, you're not allowed to eat basa taiva in the midbar, but rather you can't eat basa taiva of that species that could be brought on the mizbeach. Aval chaya, but a chaya like tzvi vayal, like a deer, you can never bring it on the mizbeach. There's no carbon of an ayal. I'm sorry, of a tzvi, and therefore lo asar achmona. The Torah. In other words, it comes out that according to Rabbi Shmuel, unlike what we understood until now, the Torah was vegetarian, was pro-vegetarianism. That's not so. The Torah was just opposed to taking that species that could be brought in the carbon and eating it for your own personal consumption. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now Rabbi Yirmiyah raised a question according to Rabbi Akiva. What happens if you did nechira in the midbar and the meat was taken across the border into Eretz Yisrael? Is it a cheftzah d'isur liolam voed? Every basar nechira shechniso l'Eretz Yisrael imoim lo aretz mao. Shall we say that now that they entered into Eretz Yisrael and the Torah says nechira is not sufficient, you need what? You need shechita, and therefore you cannot eat this basar, it never had shechita. Or should we say no, at its time, when you did the nechira, you were allowed to eat the basar. So now the heter is chal on the basar, and we're not going to undermine that heter and generate an isa just because they crossed the border into Eretz Yisrael. Emas, what period of time are we talking about? Elam v'sheva shekovshu, right? Yoshua conquered the land. It took him 7 years, and then 7 years they settled the land. Is if we're talking about the first set of 7 years, hashta davar tamei ishterilahu. The Torah allows you during the years of milchama to eat everything. You could eat whatever you're not allowed to eat. You could eat. Tichsiv ubatim oleim kol tuv. Wow. You're allowed to eat pig's meat. That's a pellet to us, right, to think about it. But that was the heter during the 7 years of Kibush Eretz Yisrael. Basar nechira miboy. How much more so if you're eating from a kosher animal, just that you didn't shecht it? It's certainly no worse than a non-kosher animal like chazir. Ella, therefore, we have no choice. But liachar mikan, we're talking about after the kibush period passed on. Ibai seimo liolam b'sheva shekovshu ki ishtere lehu shalal shalov v'kochavim didhu lo ishtere. Wow, a very lumdish Gemara. The Gemara is saying now that the heter of batim aleim kol tov only applies to that which you take from the akum in the process of destroying the goyim. Then whatever you capture, the spoils on meat, that you're allowed to eat, even if it's bacon. But as far as your own non-kosher food is concerned, you raise the pig, there's no heter for that. And therefore, Teku, Rabbi Yirmiyah's suffix remains a unanswered question. Amar Rabba Shanisa, you learned in the Mishnah, Kol Shochtim Liolim Shochtim. Is bakol shochtim my mishanisle. right? We understood the first two phrases in the Mishnah. Kol shochtim means that even oaf requires shchita. That was the previous daf. And Li'olam shochtim tells you that even nowadays that we're in Golus, we still require shchita. So the subject of the first two phrases of the Mishnah is common, and that is the chef to the basar. What do you do with the basar of oaf? What do you do with the basar in order to be matir the basar and remove the isur of Erev Menachai? But now we get to the last phrase, the third phrase in the Mishnah. It says bakol shochtim. And bakol shochtim means that we're talking about the object or the knife or the sharp instrument that you use for shchita, and bein bitzar bein b'schus bein b'kumish al kana, that you're allowed to use a flint or a glass or a stem of a reed if it's not attached. Hadumya dahanach katani. I mean, it's something very strange here. The Mishnah is changing in the same breath its subject, because I hanach b'shochtin, the first two statements are talking about not the person who slaughters, but rather the meat itself, is hainam yishochtim. So the last part should also be referring to the slaughterers. If we're talking about the meat, is haninam yishchotim. The last statement should also. So how do we juggle the Mishnah in such a way that it's all addressing one concept, one topic? Elamarava, no. Hakol shochtim is not referring to fowl, to birds, but rather kol shochtim means anyone could shecht. And it says also, what does it say also? Uli olam shochtim, is that's also referring to the person who shechts. Chada, one of whom I need lasuye kusi, v'chada lasuye Yisrael mumar. Now the last phrase in the Mishnah Le'olam Shochtim is Bein Bayom, Bein Balayla, Bein Rosh Agag, Bein Rosh Hasvina, Bakol Shochtim, Bein Bitzur, Bein Bischuchis, Bein Bikrumish Al Kana. So now we have a very consistent subject matter in the Mishnah. The entire Mishnah is addressing Shechita, telling you who could shech the animal, whether it's a mumar, whether it's a kusi, and whether or not the shechita could be done even at night, and when you could climb up to Rosh Hagag and it looks like avodah zarah, but you're allowed to do it. Rosh Hasvina, it looks like avodah zarah, but you're allowed to shecht it. And kol shochtin means that you could use any instrument that's sharp, whether it's a flint of a stone, whether it's chuchus of gold, glass, or whether it's the stem of a reed. So the Mishnah is very, what word should I use? There's one body of the Mishnah, and the underlying subject of the Mishnah is common to all these three. Now, the Mishnah had told us that there are exceptions to the rule. Not everything that's sharp can be used for shechita. Chutz mi magal katzir v'amagera. So now we're talking about various kinds of saws. A saw, has notches, and avud shmul pogam v'shadar. Now, there was one situation in which the father of Shmuel made notches in a knife. He wanted to learn the laws of a shechita knife. So he artificially or mechanically created these notches, sent it to the Chachamim, and they sent him back, a psak, whether or not the knife was kosher v'shchita. Pogam v'shadar, again, he made more notches in the blade, until finally the Chacham would give him a principle, and shalchu lev v'magera shaninu, that the only time that the knife is completely invalid for shchita is if it's kim megera, which means that it's like a saw. So let's explain, what does the Gemara mean that it's like a saw?
Can
Yeah.
you just give me 1 second?
Yeah, go
Someone
ahead.
just came in. I just have to say one thing to them. Just give me 1 second.
Yeah, go ahead. So the Gemara now is talking about, as we said, the knife that has notches in it, whether it's kosher or not. So the Gemara says the following: if it has notches that look like an inverted V, which is a saw, such that if you would put your finger through the blade, it would end up inside that notch. That's kimagera, and that's posel. But then we're going to have another type of knife, which can be used for shechita, and that's a notch where, let's say you have a blade, and the blade looks, on a slant, and then it sort of straightens out. So there's no notch that looks like a V, and therefore you would not end up, if you put your finger through the blade, end up in the middle of the notch, which is the bottom of the V, if you follow what I mean. So that's kosher for shchiton rabbanon. And now we're going to learn this in a brisa here on Daf Yud Zayin Amid Beis. Oh, shucks. What happened now? Sorry. What did I just do? Okay, 1 second. Hey, where am I? Okay, you still there? Sorry, I had some trouble with the internet apparently. Okay,
Yes, look, fine.
yeah. So we're back. Okay, hopefully we'll be okay now. So the Gemara that we're studying now is on Daf Yud Zayin Amid Beis. Sakin sheyesh bahem yesh ba pgimos harbe. If there are many different notches in the knife, then tidon ki megera, then it's considered like a saw and it's possible. But if it only has one single notch, then it depends. If it's ogeres, psula, but if it's misuchseches, ksheres. The Gemara asks immediately, what is the difference between ogeres and misuchseches? Hechi dami ogeres, hechi dami misuchseches. The Gemara says the following: Omer Rabbi Lozer, ogeres mishtei ruchos. That means that it has these sharp points that we mentioned, at that point, and it's on two different sides of the knife. So it's not as if you could use only one side of the knife because you have the notches on both sides. But misuchseches miruchas achas, it's only on one side. So in other words, even if you had, let's say, a notch on the other side, but you filed it down, and now you're left with only one single sharp point. And in such a case, the fingernail, when it passes along the blade, will be caught in only one direction. And in such a case, the Bryce establishes that the knife that contains this kind of notch is valid so long as there's only one such notch on the blade. And the Gemara immediately asks the question, why do you passel the knife if it's a notch on both sides? Because what happens is first the knife hits the animal on the outside skin, which is called the hide of the animal, and the flesh before you get to the two simonim, and in the musha basar basa. And then when you get to the second point and the second notch on the knife, it just rips out the connervation. Is that miruach achas nami? We should, by the same token, invalidate a knife that has a notch on one side because churfa de sakin machlish and mursha baza, right? The sharpness of the knife is going to undermine the flesh of the animal, and then when it gets to the point of the notch, it tears out the even if a knife has a single pointed notch, that should be invalid for shchita. And the Gemara answers the koyim aresha de sakina. Where is the notch? The notch is at the very tippy end at the front of the knife. So therefore you could cut with the rest of the knife without cutting with the notch. So the Gemara says, but wait a second. Shchita requires molech umevi. Sof ki azal machlosha. Right? The knife is extended in one direction, and then he has to bring it back to the other direction. And therefore, when he goes in one direction, again, it's going to undermine the flesh of the animal. And then when he goes the other direction, it's going to tear out the two simonim. The Gemara says, "Kigon shaholich v'lo that he pushes it forward without bringing it back. Omar Rava Gimel Midos Besakin. We have a psul of sakin, and there are three rules that determine whether that psul will invalidate the shchita. If it's an ogeres, lo yishchot v'yimshachat shchitaso psula. Right. So if it's only ogeres, which we said that ogeres is mishtei ruchos, then b'di'eved the shchita is psula. Why? Because since ogeres, it means it has notches on both sides. Misuchseches, on the other hand, lo yishchot b'lechatchila, because we're always afraid that if you go forward, you might go backwards, but im shachat shchitasa kshera. Like, for example, the case we gave before, with the notches on the tippy end of the knife. Ola v'yored b'sakin, shochi b'lechatchila. Right? If you have these impressions that go up and down along the edge of the knife, then you're allowed to shech with it even lechatchila. Meaning, if there's a gradual dip in the contour of the blade, such a dip might have originally been a true V-shaped notch, which would make it possible, whose sides were filed down, but he filed it down, and now he created a gradual curvature, not a notch, and the surface of the blade is not marred by sharp points or edges. There's no fear that the knife will cause its tearing of the simonim, but rather the cutting action of the blade will cause the shchita and the cutting of the simonim, and therefore it's kosher. Amalei Rav Huna B'rei Rav Nechemya l'Rav Ashi Amrit Lon Mishmei Rav Mesuchseches Psula. You're reporting to us in the name of Rava that Rava said that if it's only a mesuchseches, if it's mesuchseches, it's psula. We just learned in the name of Rava that mesuchseches is kshera. That although lechatchila you shouldn't use it, but b'di'eved, right? It's kshera. So lo kasha, the Gemara says there's no contradiction. Kan shaholach v'hevi, kan shaholach v'lo hevi. Right? It all depends on whether you went in both directions. Amalei Rav Acha, Berei de Rav Avya, Lirav Ashi. So now Rav Acha says to Rav Ashi that Damya Lissasa Mai, what if he cuts the edge of the knife and it's bumpy? Is that possible or not? Amalei Man Yovlan B'Bisvachlin. Anybody who gives me meat from a shchita of sasa, then I'll eat from the meat. I have no hesitation whatsoever, no problem eating from the meat. The knife did not actually have any notches, but the surface of the blade was a little bit uneven, and that's similar to what's called a sasa'ah, which is a bristle-like size of a stalk of wheat. How do we know the Torah requires you to check the sakim before you do shchita? And this pasuk is in Shmuel Aleph with regard to Shol HaMelech, and it says, "You shall slaughter with this and eat." Now, why does the Torah add? Why does the Tanakh add bazeh? The word bazeh is totally superfluous, and the answer is that bazeh implies that there was a specific knife. What was unique about this knife? He had checked it, and there was a bedika to make sure that there were no notches. Pshita. Why would I think otherwise? I mean, how do you know the knife is a valid knife without any notches unless you check it out? Keva de chinokav treifa by a bedika. The bedika is going to establish that there's no treifa, meaning if, let's say, you have a knife and you're not sure whether it could cut or puncture. If it punctures the corner, then it makes it treifa, and you have to check out the knife. So therefore, pshita, I don't understand why you have to derive from a pasuk that you have to check off the knife. I mean, if the knife punctures the simonim rather than cut the simonim, then for sure it's a treifa. And the Gemara answers l'chacham kamrinan. What I want to derive from the pasuk in Malachim by Shol HaMelech is that it's not enough for you personally, as a hedjot, to check out the knife, but you have to bring it to the sage, to the local chacham, and Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo Amru laharos chacham sacham el b'nei chvodah shel chacham. Wait a second. Are you telling me that I need to get the psak of the chacham in order to be machshir the shchita? And as if to say, if I don't bring it to the chacham, then it's not kosher? After all, the whole purpose, says Rabbi Yochanan, bringing it to the chacham is kvodah shel chacham. It's not halach and shchita, it's halach and kavod HaTorah. And the Gemara answers Mirabanan. This pasuk was not coming to establish that midaraisa you need to ask the chacham and you can't rely on your own bedika, but rather that's just an asmachta to the fact that you have to bring the sak into the chacham to check it for kavod of a chacham. B'marava badki le b'shimsha. They, in the land of Eretz Yisrael, they were willing to examine it in the sun. The sunlight was fine. But Penarda, Badkule B'maya, they would even take a look at the reflection of the knife in the water. They would glide the blade over the surface of a pool of water and study the resulting wave patterns. If the blade contained notches, it would leave a distinctive trail in the water. Fascinating. Rav Sheshes, Barakle Bereish Lishne. Wow, he would roll it down his tongue. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, Barakle Bechut Hasara. He would take a strand of hair and put it down the blade and see if it cut properly. Besura Amri, Bisra Ochla Bisra Libdaka. A knife that could cut flesh is Bisra Libdaka. Through flesh it must be examined. In other words, since the problem of a notch is the fear that it will tear the animal's flesh, we must test for the presence of a notch using actual flesh, either the tongue or the finger. Examination with other materials is not indicative, for a test with a different material that is too soft might reveal a notch that is really too small to tear flesh, while a test with a tougher material might fail to reveal a notch that would tear flesh. Amar Papa, tzricha b'dika bisra v'turfa. You have to examine the knife both on flesh and on the fingernail. Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi, Amalan Rav Sama Breder Rav Mashash Mishmach. It was said in your name, Rav Ashi, that the Amrlims that you said in the name, it transmitted in the name of Rava, the tzricha b'dika bisra v'turfa v'tlas arucha, that it's not enough to examine it with your flesh or with your fingernail, but rather you have to do it on all three sides of the blade. That means the bottom of the blade, the top of the blade, and the surface of the blade. Amalei, when Rav Ashi heard this, he said to Ravina, Bisra Tufa Amri, I may have said in the name of Rava that you require examination with flesh and in addition to a fingernail, but Atlas Arucha Lo Amri, I deny that I ever said that you need an examination on all three sides. Ikad Di Amri, now we have another transmission of Rav Ashi, and Rav Ashi said the following, that Abisra Turfa Tlas Arucha Kamar Mishmei De Rava Lo Amri, that although I do admit that I ruled that you require an examination on all three, but nevertheless, I never said it in the name of Rav. Ravina v'haracha b'red Rav Yasvi kamid Ravashi Aisu Saki l'kamid Ravashi l'bodka. They brought a knife to Ravashi to check it out. Malay Rav Acha b'red Rava Bidka. So Ravashi responds, "You do the bdika, Rav Acha." Bodka turfa v'bisra atlasaruchi did all the bdikos necessary. Amalei Rav Ashi said to him, Yasher, meaning Yasher Koyach, you did the right thing, v'chein Omer Rav Kahana, that this is the bdika that we require. Rav Yemar Omer, however, aturfa bisra tzricha tlasaruchalo tzricha. Right? There's no need, according to Rav Yemar, to examine the sides of the blade, because the shechita would be a valid shechita even if the sides contain notches. Because the reason is that first the blade cuts the two simanim, and then it hits the sides of the knife. Milo Omar of Rabbi Zera Omar Shmuel Libein Sakin v'shachat b'shchitasik shera. Right, this is a sugya we had earlier, that if you make the sakin white hot and then you shech with it shitasik shera, why? I mean, doesn't the animal die from the heat of the blade? No. Shchiduda karim lilibuna. First it cuts, and then it hits the sides of the blade. And therefore, Rav Yemer says, Kashla, we asked, Ha'ikat stadim, Yamrina beis hashchita mirvach ravach, and Hachanami beis hashchita mirvach, meaning as soon as you cut with the blade, then the two simonim sort of like separate between the two, and therefore we don't have to worry about the burning hot, white hot sides of the blade, and we don't have to worry about any notches on the side of the blade. Shalosh pegimos in three different areas of halacha. We have a psul of pegimos of notches. Which are they? Number one, pegimas etzem v'pesach. Right, the Torah says etzem lo yishbru bo. You're not allowed to break the bones of a korban pesach. And if, let's say, you made a notch in the bone of the korban pesach, that's considered as if you broke the bone, and it's possible. Pegimas ozen b'bchar. If you have an animal that's the firstborn to its mother, and therefore it's royal mizbeach, it's got to be tmimus and not a balas mum. And now we have to check the ear to make sure that there's no notch in the ear. And this we learned on Tisha B'Av, with regard to how they got the Jewish people into trouble, that whole sugya there. Okay, pegimas mum bekodshim. And in general, I'm not sure why he needs both bechar and all kodshim. Let me just see if he says anything. Oh, I see. Because a bechar is only a zachar, and kodshim could be even in a keva. So therefore, if you're shechting in a keva, you want to know whether that animal, that female animal, has a blemish, has a mum. Rav Chisda Omar Af Pegima Sakin. I don't get it. Why do you call three? There should be four. In other words, you want to know the laws of Pegima, then what about Shchita? Why did you mention Shchita? V'idach. So Gemara says, and the other Amora that Rish Lakish was questioning, why didn't he mention Sakin? And the answer is, Chullin lo kamairi. He was not dealing with Chullin, he was only dealing with Kodshim. The kula pegimosam kidei pegimas hamizbeach, and the size of the minimum size of a notch that would passel in all those three cases and in shchita is like the pegimas hamizbeach. And now the Gemara in Daf Yud Ches says v'kama pegimas hamizbeach kidei shetachkor bot siporin. Wow, you'd have to take a nail, a fingernail, and pass it over the stones of the mizbeach and make sure there are no notches that would stop your fingernail. How could that be? Meisvei. No one says that if there's a small notch that the mizbeach is possible. Lo kashli says habasida habi avna. Right, the mizbeach was made up of two parts. There were stones and there was lime that kept the stones together. With regard to the lime, there's no psul of a notch unless it's the size of either a tefach or kezayis. But with regard to the stones themselves, they have to be completely whole, whole meaning WHOLE, without any pegimos whatsoever. Okay, then this will stop, and I'll wish you a great week and a Chag Sameach. Have a
Yeah, shkoyach, Chag Sameach.
lovely Chag Shavuos.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.